Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 4 at Knee Pit Gaming. In today's setup video, we're headed to Atlanta Motor Speedway, and this will be our first opportunity in NASCAR Heat 4 to talk about tire wear and how it's going to affect the setup you use. And for that reason, I'm going to show you a couple of variations of a setup for the cup level, and then we're also going to talk about Xfinity as well as trucks. So let's get started. One of the big changes for the physics in NASCAR Heat 4 is the addition of tire wear. Now, tire wear is going to have a huge effect on the setup that you're running, so it makes sense that we need to, before we get into setup discussion, talk a little bit about the options that I use while I'm testing for these setups. So we'll start off in the options menu under the gameplay tab, and then we're going to scroll down to tire wear and fuel consumption. Normally I do this on 2x. I don't like to go any higher because I do like long green flag runs, but I understand that some of you like to go all the way up to 4x. Player tire wear rate, I like more wear. I like maximum tire wear, so I generally test on more wear and less grip under the grip fall off. So keep that in mind. If you're playing with different settings such as less wear and more grip, then that's going to change the setup that you're going to want to use in the races. So keep that in mind as we're talking about setups. What I'll try to do in each video is let you know the particular settings, because I don't go for maximum tire wear at every track, just where I feel that it is appropriate. And also keep in mind on the driving tab, there is a setting that you'll need to match up for the AI. So if you want maximum tire wear, then you need to have that on both the player car and the AI car. Or if you're going for less tire wear and more grip, then change that for the AI as well. At Atlanta, my preference is maximum tire wear. I want the maximum amount of grip fall off over the course of the run. That's very much the way it plays out in real life, and I get quite a bit of enjoyment out of the grip fall off in the game. So I'm going maximum tire wear for Atlanta. For that reason, the practice times and the one lap times really don't mean much of anything to me here. This is a track that you can easily run wide open in all three series. So maximizing your qualifying type speed is all about minimizing the amount of speed that you scrub off in the corners. And what I chose to focus on is making the car last, and specifically the tires last, over a full fuel run. So the practice time that you see, the goal time of 28.867 seconds, really doesn't mean much of anything to me. Instead, let's talk about some lap times that I think will put you at the very front of the field, both in qualifying as well as in the race against the AI. For the cup cars, we're looking at around a 29 flat, 29.1. That should get you up front there. And then, of course, the tires will fall off accordingly during the race, depending on what type of setup you go with and what type of tire wear options that you're looking at. Xfinity cars, somewhere around a 29.4, 29.5 will be just fine, and that'll get you up front as well. In the trucks, about a 30 flat, give or take, should get you up front there as well. So it shouldn't be any issue to start up front against the AI. Now let's get into a couple of different types of setups. The first setup we're going to look at in the cup cars is a more single lap qualifying type setup, which means that the goal here is to get the car turning and scrub off the least amount of speed as possible. I didn't spend a ton of time on this one, but this seemed to give me some pretty good speed. So let's briefly look at this one before we move on to more of a race long run style setup. Shock settings, this is a very bumpy track. In fact, there are some that I will swear there are ditches on corner entry sometimes. So you're going to have a lot of issues, and shocks are going to be very important. I have stuck with the 3-5 combination on both the front and the rear, and that's worked out great. But as I always say, there is no reason to believe that you can't use much more aggressive shocks and be just fine. This is simply where I find the best comfort level and what I'm going to share with you guys. Moving on to the weight settings, 52% front weight, 53.5% wedge. That's to give the car a little bit heavier feel and keep the car stable, particularly over a long run, we'll see that that's even more important. Spring settings, 1,000 pounds on the left front, 700 pounds on the right front. Now that's going to differ a little bit in the spring settings from Cup to Xfinity and then finally trucks. But here I found the 1,700 springs work really good in the front to help keep the car rotating. If you find that the car is getting too loose on entry, then either decrease the left front spring, or the major adjustment would be to increase the right front spring. That should tighten it right up on entry. In the rear of the car, 550 pounds. In the left rear, 600 pounds for the right rear. These are basically max springs. I wanted to leave a little bit of difference between the left rear and the right rear, but for all intents and purposes, these are the max rear springs. These will not be good over a long run, but for a short run of just a lap or two, they should be just fine and help to keep the car rotating throughout the corner. Tire settings, 20 pounds on the left sides, 47 and 45 respectively on the right sides. There is plenty of room for adjustment there. I find that increasing the tire pressure gives a very different feel than decreasing the tire pressure. If you want more stability in the car, then go with a little bit lower overall tire pressure, and it will generally help with the feel of the car. Miscellaneous settings. Camber here, I'm not using very much at all. A +3 on the left front, -1 on the right front. You can certainly get by with a good deal more than that. In fact, we're going to see that just a little bit later in the video. But I've had great results using very little camber, so don't worry too much about how much camber you have. Worry mostly about how that affects your tire wear over the course of a run. Front sway bar is at 1.315. Again, this is just to keep the car underneath me over a full run. Yes, I know this is only a lap or two, but I want the car to be as stable as possible rather than spending a lot of time chasing that one lap speed. Track bar is at 11 inches on both the left and the right side. This is higher than what we're going to see in the race setup, but again, this is just to keep the car rotating throughout the corner and try to scrub off the minimum amount of speed. Brake bias really isn't an issue here, particularly for qualifying, as you're not going to need them. You'll be full throttle. Grill tape isn't a huge issue because unfortunately it doesn't affect the handling of the car. It doesn't affect the drag, it doesn't affect the downforce, so 40, 45, even up to 50%, you should be just fine. Just make sure that you don't get into any engine warnings about your temperature. So 40% should work just fine. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees, which is pretty standard for me. Steering offset is at 0.05. This is a number that you'll want to adjust as you go up or down on your camber. Generally speaking, the more camber that I use in the front, the higher the steering offset gets, but I have found that 0.05 works anywhere from the camber settings you're seeing here of +3 and -1 all the way up to 5 or 6 on the left front and 5 or 6 on the right front as well. So there's a lot of variability there to tune to your comfort. Moving on to the gear settings. Did not mess with 1 through 4 on the gears. That seemed to work just fine and no real need to go into adjustments there. The rear end ratio, the final drive is at 3.25, and you have a lot of adjustability here as well. You can go up to maybe a 333. You can go down to about a 310. Any of those will work well. You just need to determine which one works best for your particular circumstance. Now that we've taken care of this one, let's move over to the Cup style race setup. This setup is designed purely about a long run and making sure that the tires last that full fuel run. Now the right rear for me wears more than the right front, so it's all about conserving that right rear while at the same time keeping the car rotating as much as possible, because we don't want to give up all of our speed in order to get that long run speed. So a lot of these settings are going to look very similar to what we were just in qualifying taking a look at, but there are going to be some very important differences. Shock settings are very much the same. Weight settings are very much the same. The differences come in when we get to the springs. So 1,000 pounds on the left front, 700 pounds on the right front. So not much different there. But in the rear of the car, that's where things start to change. As I mentioned, I want to save that right rear as much as possible, so that means reducing the amount of spring I'm running in the rear of the car. 450 and 500 seems to work out pretty well to maximize the rotation of the car, but also save that right rear tire a little bit. But feel free to reduce these numbers even more. The small amount of split between the left rear and the right rear spring helps to keep the car stable under throttle, and that'll become very important as you get later in the run, particularly if you're using maximum tire wear and grip fall off. Moving on to the tire settings, very similar here, just some minor differences for a long run car and some different inflation adjustments. Miscellaneous settings, we're using more camber here, up to a +5 and a -3. I could have done the same thing on the qualifying setup, but just wanted to show you guys a little different style. This is the most camber that I have run at Atlanta and had good results with. You can certainly get by using more camber, but it introduced some feelings in the car that I didn't really prefer, particularly over a long run, so I decided to back it off and use the +5 and -3 as my max numbers. Front sway bar, the same at 1.315 is what we were just looking at. But the track bar, you'll notice, is a good bit different. We're down to 9 inches on the left and the right, as opposed to 10 or 11 inches or more that we saw in the qualifying style setup. This is, once again, just to save that right rear tire early in the run, so it'll be there for us at the end of the run. Brake bias, once again, is not going to be a huge issue unless you come into traffic, which is certainly going to happen over the course of the long run, and that's where you'll want to tune this based on your specific needs. So the higher the brake bias you use, the tighter the car will be when you're under braking. The lower the number you use, the looser the car will be under braking, so keep that in mind, and that is certainly a setup tool that you can use to help the handling of the car. Grill tape, you can see I'm using 50% here. That will not be an issue. It's the maximum amount that I generally like to use, but over the long run, this should be no issue whatsoever. But of course, if it turns out to be an issue for you, then just simply reduce it by 5 or 10% and you should be just fine. Wheel lock and steering offset, very much the same as what we were looking at before. And you notice here in the gear settings, the rear end ratio is at a 3.1 as opposed to the 325 we were just looking at. This is to, once again, save that right rear tire a little bit. A little bit less RPM will help save that tire and give us less chance of spinning the rear tires on corner exit. That'll do it for the Cup cars. Now let's move on to Xfinity. There are going to be a lot of similarities between Cup and Xfinity and even into the trucks. So instead of going through the entire setup, let's simply focus on the areas that are different and why they're different. That brings us to the spring settings. The front springs look very familiar to us, but the rear springs are a little bit different. 500 pounds and 550 pounds here in the rear, and that is because the Xfinity car doesn't seem to wear the rear tire quite as bad with very similar setup settings. However, if you find that you are burning the right rear off of this thing over the course of a run, then by all means lower the rear springs, in particular that right rear spring, and that will definitely help out with that. Moving on to the tire pressure settings, not a whole lot different here. 47 and 45 on the right hand tires. Camber settings, again, a little bit different. Camber setting, +3 on the left front, -2 on the right front. So again, there are a variety of different camber settings that will work. You just need to find the one that feels best for you. Track bar is at 9.5 inches as opposed to going as high as 11 or as low as 9 or even lower than that. Again, this is a setting that works well for me to keep the right rear on it over the course of a full fuel run. So if you find that your car is getting loose, then by all means reduce the level of the track bar, and that will help out. Grill tape, brake bias, all of these things are very much the same. Gear settings, same way. You can get by with using something other than a 325, such as a 333 or a 310. The 325 seemed to work really well for me in the Xfinity car, and that's why I've gone with it. That'll take care of the Xfinity car. Let's finally move into the trucks. Now let's talk about some of the differences between the truck setup and the Xfinity or Cup setup. The weight settings is where we'll begin. The front weight and wedge are very similar, although not quite the same as what we were looking at previously in the other two series. Spring settings is where the differences really begin to show themselves. Left front spring at 1,000 pounds, but the right front spring is at 900 pounds. Remember, we talked earlier in the video, if you want to tighten the car on entry, an easy way to do that is to increase the strength of the right front spring. Well, here I've done just that because the car, or the truck in this case, wants to over-rotate a little bit on entry if I use the 1,000 pounds and 700 pounds that we've seen earlier in the video. So that's the reason for the increased right front spring. Moving on to the rear springs, 350 in the left rear, 370 in the right rear. So you can see there is not much rear split between those two, only 20 pounds, and that is to keep the right rear on it. You can do something similar in the other two series, and it also works very well. You can transform a car or a truck over a long run simply by adjusting the rear springs and the track bar, and that's what I have mainly been doing to get the balance that I'm looking for. Tire settings are very similar or the same as what we've seen before. Miscellaneous settings, once again, I'm using the +5 and -3 on camber, but you can certainly use less than that and have great results. You notice that our front sway bar is a little bit less, back to the 1.15 that I've used quite a bit in the past, and that seems to work really well with the trucks. Again, if you're finding that the truck is unstable, particularly on entry, then increase the front sway bar, and that will certainly help with that. Moving on to the track bar, it is at 9 inches across, and you can increase this or decrease this depending on how the car or truck is handling for you over the course of the long run. 9 inches seems to work really well for me to keep the right rear on it over the long run, but you might need to increase or decrease that as the case may be. The rest of the settings are very much the same, so that's going to do it for today. Tire wear is going to make a huge difference in the setups that you're using. So keep that in mind and really focus on the long run speed if you're using maximum tire wear. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support for NASCAR Heat 4.